Religion, Myth, and Magic, The Anthropology of Religion, Lecture 7. The Non-Human World.
I said in the beginning that religion is a human universal, and one of the universal, or at least near universal aspects of religion is an interest or understanding in the world that is inhabited by physical people versus the other world. There is a very, very common belief among human cultures that there is a physical world that is the everyday world of human existence, of human life, and coexisting with it, connected with it, or at least existing side by side with it, is another world. Now, that world may be similar in many ways. It may reflect this world, but in some way it is understood to be different from this world. That world is usually inhabited in some fashion by creatures, spirits, beings of one sort or another. They may mirror this world again, or they may be entirely different, but either way, the world exists out there and forms an important part of how the larger world is understood. Now, there is an enormous variation with this, as there is with everything having to do with humans. But whatever form it takes, this notion that there is another world out there that impinges on our own seems to be central to the vast majority of religions, if not, in fact, universal. Now, this may sound a little weird since I said at the very beginning that I didn't like the idea of a supernatural being at the heart of the definition of religion. And I still hold to that. The reason is because I think it's hard on the one hand to necessarily assume that all religions must have some component of another world in them. Whether or not people in this world care about the other world is not necessarily central to the idea of religion. It may be a part of religion, but it is not necessarily the main focus of religion. And so in that sense, it seems to me that placing an idea of another world at the core of religious definition gives it importance that it might not have in some cultures. So in other words, while it exists everywhere, it isn't necessarily given significance everywhere. The other problem is that many of the definitions invoke the notion of the supernatural. And the idea of the supernatural is a very, very tricky one to think about. In the early work that I talked about, for example, people like Tyler and Fraser, they tended to think about the supernatural as a central notion. And indeed, I'm actually right in the middle of reading a book which suggests that the notion of God is a universal because it is somehow that notion of the supernatural that binds religions together. However, most of these people, when they talk about religion in general, are thinking about religions that are relatively similar to each other, in part because they come from similar kinds of societies. If we think about the so-called world religions like Islam and Judaism, and even if we think about things like ancient Egyptian religion or Sumerian religion, that is from Mesopotamia, or indeed traditional Chinese religion, all of these religions ultimately come from very similar kinds of societies in which the deities are, number one, there, and number two, relatively hierarchical in their arrangement because they come from relatively hierarchical societies. So therefore, it's not really fair to generalize about all religions based just on these religions. So I think we need to be careful about assuming that we understand what the other world means in other religions based on what it means in those religions that we are most familiar with. The other issue has to do with the nature of the word supernatural. If we take this literally to mean above nature, which is technically what supernatural means, this concept is also not always applicable to other cultures. First, there is the idea that somehow these worlds are hierarchically arranged, and as I've just said, that's not necessarily true. They may be thought to coexist in some fashion. They may be thought to somehow reflect each other. But regardless of which it is, it's not by any means universal that somehow the other world is seen as better or more important than this world. In addition, the second thing is it may not necessarily be seen as literally apart from the natural world. I try to be very careful and not talk about the natural world, but rather to talk about the physical world. Because in many cultures, and I'd even venture to say most cultures, the notion of another world is not seen as weird or strange or unnatural. It's simply a part of the natural world that exists under slightly different rules. And so in that sense, to call it supernatural and somehow imply that it is separate from the natural world or above the natural world seems to me to be problematic in terms of its application to other cultures. If we look at examples of this, the way that the other world has seen, you can see this in action. Once again, returning to the Kaluli, who provide such a good example for so many things, their view of the natural world is very much related to the other world. That is, for them, this world, the physical world, and the other world are intimately interconnected. In fact, the way they talk about it makes it seem almost as though they inhabit the same space, but slightly different dimensions. And so in that sense, they are reflections of each other in a way. They see certain kinds of spirits as inhabiting the other world and as coexisting with ours. And so they're simply an extension of the natural world. There are other cultures and other religions in which what we consider the physical world is indeed thought to be the weird one. This is part of traditional Buddhism, for example, that the world that we see, the physical world that we know, is actually an illusion that keeps us from getting to the real world, which is the other world in some sense. And this belief is echoed again by a group in Peru, the Algorana, who I mentioned before, where the world that they see under the influence of hallucinogenic substances is perceived to be the real world. This world is not the real world. It's the other world that's the real world. So there are many complexities in terms of how people understand the other world and its relationship to this world that make it difficult to sort of generalize and call it all sort of supernatural, given what the word supernatural tends to imply for us. Now, it's worth also considering for a little bit the place that the other world inhabits in terms of human experience. If we leave aside for the moment the notion that the other world is real in some objective sense, we may be able to think about why it is that this set of beliefs is so common in human experience. In other words, we can think about what it is about human experience that makes us think in so many different cultures that there is another world out there. For one thing, the world is a very complex place. It's full of aspects which are difficult to understand, things which happen that don't seem to have clear physical causes, things that are difficult to deal with because we don't understand their causes. Things like what we would consider to be the natural world. Why does it rain? Why do people get sick? Why do people die? Why do seasons change? Where do babies come from? Things like that. These are all questions that are difficult to answer based purely on human observation. Questions that are difficult to answer based purely on what we can see around us. It is often these sorts of questions that are answered in the context of another world. Well, women become pregnant because spirits of the ancestors enter their bodies and produce babies. Or it rains because there are certain deities up in the sky who cause it to rain. People get sick because magical practitioners have sent spirits into their bodies and made them sick. These are all things that are very, very common cross-culturally, common answers to these kinds of questions that we can't answer through normal, direct human observation. Often commonly involves a perception that there is another reality apart from the physical reality. Some of this is about, again, that experience of our physical selves in relation to the rest of the world. This is something which is commonly called in psychology and in philosophy the mind-body split. The very, very common perception that we somehow inhabit our bodies. What in traditional Christian cultures we call a soul, something that we typically understand as the non-concrete part of us. So we have a physical body, and then there is the personality, the soul, the ideological aspect. Now, if we perceive ourselves that way, and that is underlined by a variety of different kinds of experiences, things like dreams, things like hallucinations, reverie, imagination, things that we do as humans, things that we can think about and experience that do not seem part of ordinary reality, then it's not a big leap to go from there to think that those forces may be out there in the rest of the world as well. So in other words, if we see ourselves as having a soul, and if we see that soul as potentially having an existence separate from us, as, for example, the being that moves around when we dream, then it's hardly a big leap to start thinking that other animals might have a soul that wander around separately from themselves. Various other kinds of things like trees and plants might have a soul, or indeed that those kinds of beings may exist separately from our physical selves. So in that sense, it may also be part of the common human experience of how we see ourselves in the world that gives us this notion that there are ways of understanding the world which includes non-physical beings, things that are out there that can exist independently of the physical reality. As anthropologists did in sort of understanding the function of ritual, they've also struggled with how to think about these other worlds in terms of interpreting them. Clearly, these other worlds are real in terms of how people themselves understand them. One of the central principles of anthropology is what's known as cultural relativism, which basically means that we have to, at least for the purposes of analysis, accept that people believe what they believe legitimately. In other words, we accept that people believe what they believe, and that's a given. And cultural relativism basically says we have to start from where they start and try to understand how they believe what they believe. So in that sense, if we're going to think about the other world, other beings, and so on, we have to at least start from the premise that those things are real to the persons who believe in them. And so from an anthropological point of view, while anthropologists themselves may not necessarily accept those things as real, they have to at least work on the assumption that people see them as real. However, there have been a few interesting cases in which anthropologists have apparently changed their beliefs in ways in which they accept that those other worlds actually do exist. Probably the most famous is Carlos Castaneda, who, as an anthropology graduate student, supposedly went off and studied with a man named Don Juan, and a series of books came out of that were very, very popular in the 1970s and the 1980s. In these books, Carlos Castaneda supposedly became initiated as a sorcerer. He learned to fly, and he did all sorts of what we would consider to be supernatural things. Now, for the most part, Castaneda is pretty much discredited in anthropology, not because he believed these things, but because there is a certain amount of evidence that he never actually did all the studies he claimed to do. And so from an anthropological point of view, the consensus would largely be that he probably made a lot of it up. But there have been other anthropologists who have had experiences like these, at least enough that it has become somewhat of an issue in anthropology. I mentioned before the book by Paul Stoller, which is called In Sorcery's Shadow, which is a very good anthropological study of a group of people in Niger, in Africa, the people known as the Sangay. And he tells the story in this book of how he became initiated as a sorcerer. He was trained by a sorcerer in the society and was, on one occasion at least, asked to perform a magical spell. And in addition, that he could have some real effect on people. By the end of the book, he became so deeply embedded in this belief system that he felt the need to flee the country because he believed he was under magical attack. So while anthropologists sometimes struggle with exactly how to represent other cultures' beliefs, in some cases anthropologists have found themselves actually accepting these beliefs and acting on them as parts of the culture themselves. There are probably lots of ways to talk about these various beings who inhabit other worlds and so on. It's possible in some senses to categorize them into various categories, but to me, I think the most useful way to think about it is in terms of two sort of cross-cutting continua. One continuum crossing another continuum. These two continua would then, one would be measuring the degree to which these individuals are related to human beings. In other words, are they independent of people, living their own lives and so on, or are they somehow deeply dependent on human beings for their existence? The other continuum would be positive to negative. In other words, again, relative to human beings, are they generally positively disposed towards us or negatively disposed towards us? So that basically gives us the endpoints of four different extremes. Those beings that are positive and independent, positive and dependent, negative and independent, and negative and dependent. And we can think about a variety of different beings using this framework to kind of explore how they relate to humans. Probably for the most part, most beings that we think of as deities typically fall into the positive, independent end of this system. Most deities are worshipped by humans, but generally feel positively disposed towards humans. The standard god, the traditional god of Judaism and Islam and Christianity would fall into this category. They are independent of people and indeed literally created people, and yet they are generally positively disposed towards people. They want good for people. And so they tend to bring good things if they are treated accordingly. Also, deities such as the goddess figure that is common in many modern pagan religions, Wicca is probably the most famous, would fall into this category. She generally is understood to be separate from people and yet to feel positively towards them. At the other end would be maybe not deities in a typical sense, but figures that are independent of people and generally are negatively disposed for them. Surprisingly, there are not all that many of them cross-culturally that fill this role. Probably the most well-known from an American perspective would be the devil or Satan from a Christian perspective. This is an individual who, through various conflicts with God, ended up falling out of favor and seems to spend most of his time causing trouble. That's predominantly all he does. A variety of other individuals would fall into this group as well, things like demons and other sorts of spirit beings whose predominant point, whose main motivation is to cause trouble for people for no reason other than simply being a pain. So it's a variety of beings that live their lives independently of humans, but when they interact with humans can either be seen as positive or negative, at least in the extremes. Now, the other end would then be dependent beings. These are individuals who, either positively or negatively, are aspects of humans or even themselves former human beings. An example of this would be the Kalali again, who have a complex series of beliefs in terms of where illness comes from. They believe that there are certain people who have an aspect of themselves which is known as a sei, and the sei is a kind of malevolent spirit that is part of some people. It can act separately from humans, but it is fundamentally connected to humans. This person goes into the other world and causes harm, usually by mutilating the spirit aspect of another person. So in other words, for the Kaluli, we all have spirit aspects that exist in the other world, and those spirit aspects can affect us if bad things happen to them. So the Sei is understood to go into the other world and do things like cut off people's legs and split them open and put rocks in their throats and things like that. And that is understood to have a negative effect on people here. The remedy for that, which we will talk more about when we talk about magic and witchcraft, is for somebody to send their spirit aspect into the other world and repair that damage. So in this case, whether they're positively or negatively disposed, clearly they are closely connected to humans in that they inhabit humans. They're the spirit aspect of a human, and therefore they are dependent on them in that sense. Another version of this sort of creature would be ancestor spirits, people who are the spirit aspect that has survived the death of the physical body. In this case, ancestor spirits that go to the other world were once humans, and therefore, in that sense, they are dependent on humans. They were once human beings, and therefore, they have an interest in what happens in the physical world. Now, they may be positively disposed towards the human world, or indeed negatively disposed towards the human world. In some cases, for example, in traditional Chinese religion, they are generally positively disposed. There is a tendency for them to want good things for us. And as long as all of the rituals are carried out, then the ancestors will provide abundant harvests and generally a good harmonious life. However, sometimes the spirits of the dead are not entirely thrilled about being dead. And we'll talk more about the spirits of the dead later. But for present purposes, the point is that they may, in fact, because they are hanging around, because they are no longer alive and therefore no longer part of the society, they may cause trouble. And indeed, in some cultures, the possessions of the dead are specifically destroyed precisely because they want to discourage the spirits of the dead from hanging around here. They want them to go into the next life. In that case, then, again, they're ancestor spirits. They were once human beings. And so in that sense, they are intimately connected to human beings, but they are angry at being dead, and therefore they are negatively disposed towards people. To some extent, the example I mentioned when I talked about the function of ritual, the Japanese Mizokokuyo ceremony, is also about this sort of being. In this case, again, the spirit of the dead child is understood to be angry about the death, and therefore may cause sickness if that child is not appeased through ritual. So these are a variety of different spirits that on the extreme ends of these two continua are either positively or negatively disposed towards humans and either live independently or indeed once were intimately connected to humans. Now, between these extremes, there are many different kinds of variations. So there are infinite possibilities if we look for variations in terms of the extremes I've just outlined. The Kaluli, for example, have an elaborate notion of the other world, which is inhabited by a group of spirits who are known as Mamul. Mamul spirits are pretty much right down the middle of both continua, as I mentioned before. These are individuals that live more or less independently of people, but yet they are somehow connected to them because things that happen to them can have an effect in this world. The Mamul are also neither positive nor negative. They're simply out there living their lives in the way that people do. And in fact, the Mamul are understood to inhabit the other world in effectively the exact same way that we inhabit this world here, or technically, I suppose, the way the Kaluli inhabit their world. The Mamul are understood to live in huts. They hunt pigs. They grow various plant foods, and they generally go on and live their lives. Now, what's interesting about this system is that the Mamul, while living separate lives, nevertheless can have a significant impact on people. And that happens because each of these groups, that is humans and Mamul spirits, are understood to have spirit reflections in the opposite world. So the Mamul have spirit reflections in this world, humans have spirit reflections in the other world. Now, sometimes when the mamul go hunting, they might shoot a pig. And if they shoot a pig, it might just be a pig, and in which case the mamul eat and everybody's happy. But it might also be a spirit reflection of somebody in this world. And when they do that, then somebody in this world will die. So, in this case, the mamul are not necessarily bad. They're not doing anything wrong. They're simply hunting. They're doing what everybody does. From that point of view, we can't really say that they're negatively disposed towards humans. It's just that sometimes they do things that have a negative impact on human life. And in fact, the opposite can happen as well. Sometimes for the Kalali, when they're walking along the forest roads and they find a pig and they kill it, sometimes it can accidentally be a mamul spirit and a mamul spirit will die. So from that point of view, neither side is really trying to hurt anybody. It just sometimes happens. And so in this case, the mamul spirits are simply out there. Their actions have an impact on people, but there's really nothing you can do about it. There's no sense that in which the Kalali try to appease the mamul or worship them or indeed influence them in any way. They're just simply out there living their lives, and sometimes in that process, the two worlds interact and can cause problems. Also kind of in the middle of these two continua would be what were identified by some of the early anthropologists as trickster figures. These are figures that, again, are mostly independent of humans, but seem utterly fascinated by the human world. Some of the better known ones are beings like Coyote, which is a common figure in Native American mythology, and even Loki, who is actually a trickster figure in traditional Scandinavian religion. You may be more familiar with Thor and Odin and all those guys. All of these trickster figures seem to be independent beings in the sense that they're never understood as kind of former people or the souls of the dead or anything like that. And yet they seem totally unable to resist making things happen in the human world. Therefore, they can cause trouble, usually not maliciously. That is, there's generally the understanding that there's no real malice here. They're just sort of doing what they do because that's what they do. But it can often cause trouble in the human world that will then need to be fixed. And often that is where humans and deities come into interaction. Trickster figures can come in, cause trouble, and therefore make a mess, which then has to be repaired somehow, usually bringing humans and deities into some kind of contact with each other. So trickster figures are, again, somewhere kind of in the middle of these two continua. They're not really bad or good, and they kind of live an independent life, but through the living of that life, they seem to become involved in human lives usually for negative reasons, but often with a positive outcome in the end. Now, I mentioned voodoo spirits before, who are known as Loa spirits, and these are also ones that mostly, they tend towards the positive end, and they have certain connections with people, but they don't lie on either extreme. Loa spirits are sometimes the souls of the dead. In some cases, dead human souls can eventually, with time, return in the form of Loa spirits. But more often, they tend to be seen as separate spirits. However, for a variety of reasons, those spirits want to experience human life again. Now, this then becomes kind of a bargain. On the one hand, the Loa spirits want to experience the joys of being human, eating and drinking and smoking and things like that. On the other hand, they have knowledge, insight, information that can be useful to humans. And so one of the central focuses of voodoo religion is, in fact, to facilitate that bargain. In the context of dancing and trance, which was how I mentioned them before, the spirits are deliberately brought into humans. Human beings are possessed by these spirits, who then go on and use that experience to, on the one hand, from the spirit point of view, experience being human again. So while they inhabit human bodies, they can party and have fun and talk to people and have a cigarette and all those things that they can't do since they're in the spirit world. And in exchange for that, they give humans knowledge, insight. They may effect healing. They may do all kinds of good things in exchange for the experience of inhabiting a human body again. So from that point of view, it's kind of a trade-off. Loa spirits, again, they're neither good nor bad, and they don't necessarily live completely independently from people. Instead, what tends to happen is they want to be human again, and therefore they try to achieve this sort of bargain where they get to experience all the things of humans and yet not necessarily give up their spirit identity completely. Now, these are only some examples of the multitude of non-human beings, which run the gamut, as I said, from individual human souls right the way up to independent deities. They're clearly a crucial part of religion and seem to lie at the core of religion. If we think about the definition that I gave at the beginning, we would tend to see them as providing explanations for things that are difficult to understand, things which don't seem to have obvious physical causes, and also ways of understanding how it is that we interact with the world in ways that don't seem straightforward from a physical perspective, things like visions and dreams and so on. So, in addition to those individuals who believe that these beings exist, there is also the larger function that they provide an explanation for a variety of human experiences. And so from that point of view, they form a kind of central part of religion as we understand it. Now, if religion, therefore, is sort of intimately connected to these kinds of experiences and so on, and if these things are shared across human cultures, then that suggests that religion is somehow a fundamentally human thing. And that in turn raises the question of where that came from. Why is that something that all humans have? Is it something that humans have always had? When can we first detect it in terms of understanding the past? And so we will turn in our next lecture to the origins of religion, where a religion may have come from, how far back we can trace it into human history, and therefore when it began to become a significant part of human cultural experience.
This ends Lecture 7.